Only power restrains power. Only variety restrains variety. The former, informally, could be called Burnham's law of elite theory, and the latter is more formally known as Ashby's law of requisite variety. In this video, we will discuss some expansive topics: power, variety, and the science of control, cybernetics. The world that we live in today is unfathomably and unspecifiably complex, yet it functions, it adapts, and it survives. To use another word, it is viable. And if it is a viable system, then it must, by necessity, be a controlled system. The science of control and control systems, cybernetics, seeks to identify the rules and laws that make a viable system viable. Non-viable systems do not exist, or if they do exist, they exist only in brief flashes. In other words, they do not pass the law of requisite variety. Or to put it more plainly, non-viable systems are not robust, not durable, fragile, non-competitive, and thus do not maintain a positive negentropy balance with their environment. If viable systems all start out as mere twinkles in their father's eye, then non-viable systems, perhaps, are just synaptic flickers in the minds of fools. We ourselves are all viable systems, otherwise we would not exist. And so are all the societal systems that we inhabit, although some do work better than others, but from within that ambiguous and subjective term better, the devil is in the details. Or rather, nature and her dynamics always decide the meaning of better, rather than ideologically encumbered humans. To quote Stafford Beer, the father of management cybernetics on systems and control, systems are and systems work. If not, they are not systems at all. Control is what facilitates the existence and operation of systems. Systems do not come into existence from within a vacuum, but rather from within a seething cauldron, one where rival systems are also too struggling to be and stay viable. Only variety restrains variety, only power restrains power. There is power in numbers, there is power in cunning, there is power in speed, and there is power in brute strength. Or better yet, there is power in all four. Systems are themselves composed of subsystems. On the individual human level, some of our subsystems include our autonomous nervous system, our organs, our metabolic machinery, and our brains. And our human brains are perhaps one of the most sophisticated and complex systems ever devised by nature and her evolutionary and heuristic processes. The ability of the human brain to increase its own internal complexity via the process of learning enables us to handle an ever-increasing spiral of environmental variety, something that makes us comparable to nothing else in the natural world. Or that is the case for the time being anyway, until perhaps artificial general intelligence and superintelligence eventually comes to take the throne. But as humanity would ultimately birth the superintelligent AI, I suppose there is some kind of consolation prize nested in there somewhere. There is also a sort of double-edged drawback that we must encounter and confront along this whole developmental trajectory. As our advanced societies become more complex, we become more and more dependent on our advanced societal metasystems for our own survival. In other words, in aggregate, we are no longer viable without the advanced societies in which we are nested. We, the human subsystems, are increasingly, and now perhaps terminally, dependent on the higher order, advanced societal systems in which we reside. But as long as we, and more importantly, our societal systems keep maintaining their steady state, keep adapting, evolving, and surviving, we stay alive. We stay viable. Strive to be viable. And if one is to be viable, understanding the rules of the viability game may be a benefit in that pursuit. Viable systems are nested Matryoshka doll systems. In other words, there are autonomous subsystems, a person, for instance, which is itself nested within a larger subsystem, like a workplace or a community or a family. which is then nested in a larger subsystem, like a nation, etc., etc. But the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts, and it is from this holistic whole that viability emerges. Your liver functions autonomously without you knowing that it is doing its job, and you would cease to be viable without your liver. And similarly, if your liver were removed and plopped down on the table, so too would your liver cease its autonomous function. If you take out one of the middle dolls of a matryoshka nest, the whole assembly just rattles about annoyingly. In other words, it ceases to be a matryoshka doll and instead becomes a kind of non-optimized box. In other words, each autonomous subsystem within the hierarchical assembly interacts with its environment. For the tiniest of matryoshka dolls, its most proximal environment is the interior of its nearest in size sister, but also, less proximally, it is also contained within all of its larger sisters. Where one goes, all follow. And at the boundary of the largest doll, the whole nested matryoshka doll assembly interacts with perhaps the true environment, nature. Nature and all of her variety that she can bring to bear, and her ultimate selector switch, evolutionary competition between rival and symbiotic systems. Only variety restrains variety, and only power restrains power. Survival and viability is a game played between the system and its environment, and the interactions between the system and its environment are tallied on a score sheet. Broadly, we can think of this score sheet as being counted in thermodynamic terms, as a metabolic ledger of negentropy. As Schrödinger said, the living organism feeds on negative entropy, and if it does not adequately feed on negative entropy, such that it maintains a positive negentropy balance, it ceases to be a living organism. In response to increasing environmental variety, if one is to survive and be viable, then one must increase their own internal complexity, for, as Ashby's law of requisite variety states, only variety restrains variety, and complexity is variety. If the system cannot handle all of the variety that its environment throws at it, then it ceases to be viable. It ceases to exist. To quote Beer, systems are and systems work. If not, they are not systems at all. Control is what facilitates the existence and operation of systems. End quote. Further, within this broader environment that we call nature, a nature that is governed by evolutionary dynamics and thermodynamic laws, there are in fact many systems vying for supremacy, competing to be viable. As such, we could say there is both inter-system competition, while also all systems themselves are surviving and mass balancing themselves against the entropic winds of the environment, nature, and its inviolable laws. But systems, if they are to be viable, will also seek to constrain and control their environment and its variety as much as possible. In other words, to cultivate their environments such that they are more predictable, standardized, and more viability supporting. Even birds do this when they make their nests out of twigs and from pieces of plastic bag strands that they find on the sidewalk. Systems which more greatly succeed at managing the variety and variability of their own environments will succeed and beat out systems that do not excel at this. When it comes to human societal systems, this could be viewed as the complexity arms race mechanic, or merely as the history of human civilizations. But although human civilizations rise, they eventually do fall. However, maybe, eventually, if a societal metasystem gains enough self-knowledge and grows to accommodate some critical threshold of environmental variety, perhaps it can engineer itself out of its own destruction. In the animal kingdom, in a similar vein, there are many species that are indomitable. No matter where they go, they seem to succeed and outcompete their rivals. In addition to species like mice, rats, and cats, which seemingly thrive in almost any environment, in America specifically, we can further list European sparrows, starlings, feral pigs, and the invasive species of Asian carp, which routinely grow to 50 pounds and occur in such numbers that it can even be dangerous to boat on some American waterways because a massive fish might leap out of the water, crash into your head, and then plop itself into your boat. But animals, generally, lack the self-awareness and ability to consciously and continuously improve themselves, whether it be their hardware or software, and thus there is perhaps a sort of limit to their advancement. But in 300 years' time, if the climate continues to degrade, I would bet that there will still be plenty of mice, rats, cats, European sparrows, feral pigs, and Asian carp, even if biodiversity plummets substantially. Some systems, or so it seems, are indeed super viable and super adaptable. Systems which do not rise in terms of their own internal complexity, those which do not increase their internal capacity in response to increasing environmental variety, will either be scattered to the wind or be absorbed as captive subordinate components of a larger, more complex, and more viable system. In other words, these outcompeted systems, if they survive at all, become fully dependent kernels that are trapped and imprisoned somewhere within a larger Matryoshka assembly, held like some kind of museum piece battle trophy, like something to entertain curious onlookers. Isn't that quaint? But as always, it is a battle against the environment as well as a battle against all of the participating systems that operate and exist within the environment. Particularly clever systems, and indeed humans are quite clever, will themselves begin to constrain aspects of the variety and variability of their environments. To live inside of a climate-controlled house with running water is an environment where local environmental variety has been constrained. The invention of agriculture was the drive for humans to constrain the variety and variability of their environments, or at least to mitigate the variety of the environment by purposefully building up a surplus of food, a store of energy needed to maintain their steady states and their internal negentropy, such that they could better march forward into the corrosive entropic winds of time. A more well-fed group would outcompete and displace underfed groups. Today, we are all descendants of successful human tribes that outcompeted and displaced unsuccessful human tribes, lineages that no longer exist. And in 300 years' time, the humans on Earth will be the same. Perhaps they will speak of the great bottleneck that was the algorithmic internet, a period of tremendous technological acceleration, where many were driven insane while others stayed viable. But in 300 years, however, it is still to be determined whether human civilization will continue its advancement, or if it will have instead collapsed back to some more primitive state. If the Extinction Rebellionist types have their way, it would be the latter. But as I would assert, such types are not system thinkers, but instead merely slogan spouters, so the metasystem can quite easily keep them contained to some performative playpen-like area, where they can fling tomato sauce, scream about, and glue themselves to things. In other words, for the metasystem itself, the masses are part of the environmental variety that it must manage and restrain, but more on that later. A drought is one example of nature and the cruelty of its variety. Without adequate food stocks, a drought leads to famine. A surplus of food derived from increasingly complex agricultural practices acts to mitigate the effects of drought. In other words, it is a means by which to mitigate and restrain environmental variety. But the two things, the system and its environment, are forever locked in a spiral. There is always a new Red Queen to plague and challenge the king who wishes to be eternal, as perhaps all kings do. And there always exists a carrying capacity. As technology and complexity increases, the carrying capacity of the environment, the maximum number of humans that it can support, increases. But if something goes awry, and the system and its control systems go haywire, it will all come crashing down, and the further up it goes, the farther it can fall. Viable systems, living systems, or so it seems, will always seek to grow and expand until they hit some kind of hard boundary. As one logistics curve begins to flatline and growth slows, a viable system will need to switch gears onto a new logistic curve such that growth can be maintained. Otherwise, it faces collapse. The boundaries of its enclosure will start to contract rather than expand, like one of those tomb traps in Indiana Jones. Tomb traps are not viability inducing. And as the times change and we advance to higher and higher logistics curves, or as we climb up the envelope curve, which is its more holistic name, the modality of our own internal capacity to handle variety changes. Some things become vestigial. Perhaps this is why the archetypal gray alien has a small spindly body, a gigantic head, and huge eyes that act as sensors. Such a creature no longer needs to be physically strong, and its metabolic demand is optimized, and thus its viability is maximized by investing almost all of its resources into a big brain and a big sensor array. Just some kind of reflection of ourselves being beamed into our consciences from some near or far distant future. Or as other theories go, gray aliens may be synthetic life forms created by past versions of humanity after they reached the singularity, after which the winners decided to chill up in space inside of the moon or under the Antarctic ice. But before they got out of Dodge or off the flat sitting duck target that is the surface of Earth, they decided to hit the civilizational reset button on their fellows such that they could not follow. Or as an experiment of sorts, to run the whole experiment over again just to see what would happen. And the little gray aliens are ultra-efficient synthetic life forms, sensor probes, sent here to monitor the show. You can't do science without replicate analysis, after all. But back to Earth and our apparent material reality. In the past, people had the skills of self-sufficiency and could live off the land. For us, today, that is no longer true. And even if all 8.5 billion people on the planet did have the skills to live off the land, we would not all be able to survive because the carrying capacity of that modality is perhaps only 1 billion people's worth at most. As such, whether we like it or not, we have skin in the game, because if our societal systems crumble, if the collective we cannot sufficiently manage variety, we, too, will crumble along with our societal system. Our complex, advanced, postmodern societies have enabled us as a species to expand far beyond the carrying capacity of our planet. Instead of a limit of 1, 2, or 3 billion people on Earth, we now have nearly 8.5 billion, and by 2050, it is projected to be almost 10 billion. In our present circumstance, some people can in fact live off the land as homesteaders, but they can only do this because so few people choose to do so. In other words, there is a supply and demand mechanic at play, as there always is. Supply and demand, or so it seems, is another one of those inviolable laws. And realistically, even the most off-the-grid modern homesteader still relies on the broader technicized and globalized machine for much of their materiel. Further, despite the idyllic fantasies of some Rousseauian types, the people who live in non-advanced societies, and who may still live in a semi-traditional fashion, are still themselves largely dependent on advanced nations and the technicized machine for food, medicine, and aid. At this point in the game, there is no escaping the machine. We are all dependent on it. But on this topic of industrial productivity, carrying capacity, and population size, it is worthwhile to stop and examine some data. It is, of course, true that citizens of advanced nations consume much more energy and resources than their non-advanced nation counterparts. But we can also look to the future and see what future demand for energy and resources will be as a result of population growth. And as we will see, population growth is not evenly distributed across the globe, but rather it is most concentrated in the nations that themselves have very low economic productivity. Further, there is the average amount that a person consumes, but there is also the number of people doing the consumption. If a smaller country, let's say country A, which itself has a declining population, consumes 10 times more resources per capita than a larger country, country B, which itself has an immense and rapidly growing population, the resource demand from the larger and rapidly growing country B will eventually eclipse the smaller country's resource consumption, even if the people in country B are much, much poorer with respect to their level of resource consumption. Further, as people are lifted out of poverty, their rate of resource consumption will go up rapidly in relative terms. Again, we encounter the logistics curve. In other words, the consumption of resources, as with many things in nature, follows a logistics curve or a sigmoid curve, i.e., it goes through a period of slow growth, then rapid growth, then eventually it plateaus. With respect to the material footprint per capita, a metric of consumption, we can see that the increase in material footprint per capita for high-income countries in between the years 2000 and 2017 was almost flat, whereas the increase in consumption for the other income categories was much, much higher, especially so for the upper middle income countries, which include countries like China. Further, the citizens of some nations are much, much more productive than the citizens of other nations, i.e., the citizens of some nations produce and output a much, much higher amount of value-added goods than the citizens of other countries. In our present day, the citizens of China are no doubt the most productive in absolute material terms. Now, the irregularity in the productive output of various countries is not necessarily the fault of the citizens of any nation, but rather it is largely a side effect of the environment and the presence of infrastructure and high-value capital equipment in particular. Although some environments, or so it would seem, are not very supportive or accommodating of either of those things. As a result, in many nations, for example, there is simply little to almost no demand for labor. In other words, again, it is a supply and demand issue. If the supply of labor dramatically outpaces the demand for labor in a locale, then the opportunity for laborers is thus scanty and people remain poor. Further, generally, we can think of poverty reduction as the result of two competing rates, the rate of economic growth versus the rate of population growth. If the population grows faster than the economy grows, people stay poor. Now, of course, there is further complication with respect to how the economic gains are distributed. The gains will always be disproportionately distributed to the top echelons of a population, rather than to the bottom. Cry about it if you want, old man on lawn yelling at clouds. But this just means that the economic growth rate must outpace the population growth rate even more if people are to get out of poverty. China, as an example, got its population out of extreme poverty by doing two things. One, massively accelerating its economic growth by receiving trillions of dollars in foreign direct investment and technology transfers from the West, such that it could maximally leverage and exploit its immensely huge, culturally homogeneous, and educated populace, which further enabled China to profitably export goods en masse to Western consumer markets that were at that time still rich. But since this process also depleted and extracted the wealth from the Western middle-class consumer segment that was doing all this buying, this game is no longer viable and thus cannot be easily replicated by other countries. And two, China escaped poverty by severely and artificially constraining its population growth in the period preceding its economic rise by the blunt force hammer that was the one-child policy. These two aspects, generally, were responsible for the Chinese miracle, and it was a miracle because these two rates, economic growth and population growth, were both controlled and steered in such a way that the result was China, quote-unquote, miraculously escaping poverty. But there are no miracles, just the advantageous balancing of competing rates. Further, China is itself a singular nation in many, many regards, and this makes it basically impossible for any other country to copy the Chinese method in hopes of duplicating China's success. There are a variety of reasons for this, which I attempted to summarize in that previous run-on sentence, and I have discussed many of them in more detail in past videos. Now, the reason that I am taking this detour is that from a cybernetics perspective, the globalized control system has to successfully interact with and manage its environment. Ashby's law of requisite variety states that a system is only viable if its own internal capacity to handle variety matches or exceeds the variety of its environment. And as such, much of the engineering challenge is finding ways to constrain and mitigate the variety and variability of the environment itself. And we can roughly split this environmental problem into two imminently controllable parts. One, the technicized and globalized economic machine and its inputs and outputs. And two, the globalized masses and their inputs, outputs, and behaviors. For simplicity, we'll exclude the third part, which is perhaps the true environment, i.e., nature's unforeseen externalities, the climate, asteroids from space, natural disasters, etc. But in our analysis, we will make sure to abide by the constraints dictated by thermodynamics and physics. That part of the environment must always be considered. As far as what we have chosen to exclude, if we reference science fiction, at some point a metasystem, if it manages to not collapse under its own weight, eventually finds ways to modify the environment on a planetary or even solar system-wide scale. But that is probably a ways off for now, and we'll exclude it from our analysis. So we'll focus on two environmental parts that need to be managed: the globalized machine itself and the globalized masses. And these two parts of the environment interact strongly with one another, i.e., the globalized masses are the pool from which productive workers are recruited, and the globalized masses themselves consume the outputs of the economic machine as their inputs. If the controlling metasystem fails to balance all of these inputs and outputs, it can result in a catastrophic system failure and collapse, i.e., a rapid collapse in the carrying capacity of the globe, and an equally rapid collapse in the global population. As such, the general productivity of the globalized masses, their numbers, their behavior, and their resource consumption is thus of critical importance to the control system. Further, the controlling metasystem must cybernetically steer the global masses such that their behaviors over time align with the interests of the holistic system, since, as I stated, we are all now critically dependent on the continued viability of our shared globalized metasystem. Overall, we can think of this as stability engineering, but we'll get more into that later. And we can point out that the control and cybernetic management of the technicized and globalized economic machine is basically already ironed out. In other words, it is mostly a solved problem. At present, the globalized managerial mesh, the coordinated bureaucracies of the mass state, the managerial bureaucracy of international corporations, the shareholder aggregators and asset managers, and the central banking institutions already employ standardization, algorithms, big data, and cybernetic management techniques. Enterprise resource planning, ERP software, maintenance, repair, and operations, MRO software, customer relationship management, CRM software, ISO standards, advanced econometrics, near constant satellite surveillance of the Earth's surface, such that nearly all critical inputs can be harvested, etc., etc. The terminologies and abbreviations most likely stretch on for days. These cybernetic management and control systems have been pioneered and implemented already over the past several decades. The so-called information technology revolution, as it was, could easily instead be called the cybernetic revolution. But the new and emerging metasystem, the top-level controller in the hierarchy of the cybernetic management system, will increasingly be AI management, i.e., as the system continues to get more complex, really, no humans will even be able to handle the challenge of managing it based on the sheer data volume alone. Too much lossy filter makes even the smartest set of humans dumb, but in all likelihood, the system will still need a highly capable and productive human workforce for decades to come. Technicians, builders, and mechanics, especially. Human operators. If you are a young person trying to figure out what to do with your life, go into the trades or some field where you have to wrestle with the environment and learn to adapt such that you can adequately restrain its variety. And because humans will, in all likelihood, still be needed for these roles, That means that at least some of us will have to be kept viable, capable of handling new kinds of variety, such that we can work to maintain the metasystem, its subcomponents, and its infrastructure. Optimistically, then, not all of us will necessarily have to live in the brain rot pod and eat the bugs and so on and so forth, or at least we can hope. So then, in other words, if the running of the globalized and technicized economic engine is basically already being run and managed cybernetically, then the primary environmental challenge for this emerging artificially intelligent controller will be the managing of the globalized masses themselves. To ground our analysis, we'll look at some data in order to help us get a lay of the land with respect to the globalized masses. If for every country in the World Bank database we plot the fertility rate, measured as the average number of births per woman, on the x-axis, and then plot manufacturing value added per capita, or MVA per capita, on the y-axis, we can get a global picture of both population growth and economic productivity. Here, we can see that manufacturing value added, or MVA, which is a measure of economic productivity, is inversely related to fertility rates, to say the least. The fertility replacement rate is 2.1 births per woman, and we can see that virtually all of the productive nations, as measured by MVA per capita, are well below replacement rate, whereas virtually all of the countries which have fertility much above the replacement rate, say above 3 births per woman, have very low manufacturing value added per capita, with all but a few of them being below an MVA per capita of $1,000. Further, some countries have exceedingly high birth rates of 4, 5, or 6 births per woman, while these countries also have vanishingly small productivity as measured by MVA per capita, generally being below $500. And again, I'm not concerned with disentangling why these countries have low economic productivity, just merely that they do, and that the countries with the highest birth rates do indeed have vanishingly small manufacturing value added per capita figures, which we use here as a proxy for economic productivity. So in other words, the most economically productive advanced societies, the technological societies, are decreasing in population, while the much less productive countries are expanding faster and faster thanks to the abundance that has been delivered by the technicized, globalized economic machine. Food, medicine, synthetic fertilizers, financial aid, etc., etc., where globally and holistically, this technicized, globalized economic machine is itself a metasystem or a life support system that keeps us all alive. In other words, the carrying capacity of the Earth has been raised tremendously to a carrying capacity of at least 8.5 billion, up from what was perhaps a carrying capacity of 1, 2, or 3 billion post-agricultural and post-industrial revolutions, respectively. If we examine extreme poverty over the past 30-plus years, we can find that it has plummeted as a result of this abundance. And people will complain that things aren't perfect. Old man stands on lawn and yells at clouds, but not being perfect is still much better than starving to death or dying prematurely from easily preventable or curable diseases. We can also examine manufacturing value added per capita in aggregate by examining the MVA per capita of countries as grouped by income. Here we can see that the high-income countries have MVA per capitas that are around 80 times and 20 times higher than the low-income and lower middle-income group countries, respectively. And similarly, the upper middle-income countries outpace the bottom two income groups by a factor of 7 to 30 times. But on the topic of the relative increase in consumption as people are lifted out of poverty, we rapidly run back into the resource problem. Here, we will examine some UN data on the metric known as material footprint per capita, measured in metric tons per person. If we look at the 2017 figures, we can see that the high-income countries have a material footprint per capita that is around 13 times higher than the low-income countries, and around 6 times higher than the lower middle-income countries. And if we instead compare the low and lower middle-income countries to the upper middle-income countries, to countries like China, we can see that the upper middle-income countries consume around 4 to 9 times more resources than the lowest two income groups. And just to ground this all out, on the level of global population, the low and low middle income countries are roughly 50% of the global masses, and the upper middle and high income countries are roughly the other 50% of the global masses. So that's the rough proportions that we're working with. And as a reminder, today there are approximately 8.5 billion humans on Earth. In the year 2000, there was only 6 billion, and in 1950, there was only 2.5 billion. So more or less, the notion that the upper middle income and high income countries consume around 5 to 10 times more resources per capita than poor nations roughly holds. And if we take a look at this world population broken down into these country-based income categories, we can see that high income countries represent 18% of the world population, upper middle income countries represent 35%, and low and lower middle income countries represent 9 and 38% respectively, or nearly 50% of the world's population in aggregate. So we can basically break the world's population into two halves, the high and upper middle income nations and the low and lower middle income nations. Or more broadly, we can think of one half as being the advanced technological societies, while the other half are non-technological societies. And then we can flash back to the manufacturing value added per capita broken down by the income group of countries. We can roughly say that the MVA per capita of the top 50% of the world outpaces the bottom half of the world quite substantially. The MVA per capita of the low income group countries was around 80 and 30 times less when compared to the high income and upper middle income countries, whereas the lower middle income countries had MVA per capitas that were 17 and 7 times lower respectively. And again, I'm not concerned with disentangling why these countries have lower economic productivity as measured by MVA per capita, just merely that they do. And then, with respect to consumption, if we examine the relative increase in material footprint per capita in between the years 2000 and 2017, the peak years of globalization and its dividends of increased global abundance, we can see that the material footprint per capita in high-income nations was very stable, only increasing by 2% relative to the year 2000, whereas the low middle, and upper middle income countries increased their material footprints per capita by 43, 66, and 112% respectively. Or to think of this as a logistics curve, the high-income countries have already plateaued with respect to their resource consumption. The upper middle countries are somewhere on the steeper part of the curve, and the bottom 50% of the global population are still on the lower sloped approach, waiting to explosively increase their consumption. Further, we must remember that humans are status-seeking creatures of relative difference, i.e., generally a person will want slightly more than their neighbors. The absolute amount of resources that the material-seeking person has is never important, only the amount relative to his neighbors. One very important thing to point out about that huge rise in upper middle income consumption is that that category, of course, includes China and its enormous and increasingly wealthy population. But as everyone knows, China's population is in decline, just like it is in nearly all advanced nations or technological societies broadly. Currently, and perhaps more surprisingly, if we take a look at India's fertility rates, we'll find that India, too, has now become more or less at or below replacement rate. We can also point out that India, the population of India is roughly 1.4 billion, and they make up almost half of the lower middle income group category, whereas China makes up roughly half of the upper middle income group category. That's just some additional reference points when we think about the global population and how it breaks down. So that is some more data to ground us in our analysis as we move forward. Those are some of the constraints, pressures, and variety being exerted by the globalized masses. There are absolute numbers, and then there are the rates at which those numbers increase or decrease, and both are important to keep in mind. And we can also look at those rates longitudinally. If we examine the fertility rate of these country-based income groups from 1960 to 2023, we can see that fertility rates have already been declining for quite some time. The high-income countries fell below the replacement fertility rate of 2.1 births per woman back in the early 1970s, and the upper middle countries fell below the replacement rate back in the early 1990s, whereas the low-income countries have declined from a peak of almost 7 births per woman in 1980 down to around 4.6, and the low-middle income group will probably fall below replacement rates sometime in the next decade. For the advanced technological countries and our declining populations, our populations are perhaps merely sensing the declining demand for our labor, and we are decreasing our populations accordingly. Another supply and demand mechanic. And of course, the declining birth rates in the advanced so-called technological societies are also a result of postmodernity, as well as quote-unquote successful behavioral modification strategies, or what could be understood as cybernetic behavioral steering. We can also note that the algorithmic internet, social media, the trend of overeducation, novel, let's say, ideologies, and the behavioral modification capacity of these ideological systems has and will continue to play a role in reducing or managing the birth rates of technological societies in the future. Basically, it is like a sort of delocalized miasmatic birth control. And we could say, as the algorithmic internet continues to grow, penetrate, and propagate whatever viral ideological packets of information it has been carrying to even the most remote recesses of the globe, eventually these behavior steering systems will continue to put downward pressure on the birth rates of even the non-advanced, non-technological societies as well. And if we look at the data, we can already see that the birth rates in developing countries have been declining over the past 2 decades as a result of globalization. Perhaps at a high level, that is what USAID was doing. The term 4D chess has become a sort of trite joke, but the elites do indeed play 4D chess. We can also understand that material consumption and material expectations are also a product of ideology and social and behavioral engineering. Bertalanffy's so-called buying automata and the algorithmic information space can also easily change our consumption patterns over time if it so desires. But on the topic of the collapse of birth rates in productive advanced nations, soon AI and automation will largely take up the slack caused by the declining populations in advanced nations. Plus, as Western consumer markets become tapped out as a result of the annihilation of the Western middle classes, demand for tangible goods and services will decline, ushering in what will be the end of the consumer society model as we know it. Digital goods are much more efficient after all, and the gamified video game ecosystem has demonstrated that the human drive for status can be provided synthetically in the form of silly digital tokens, unlockable skins, leaderboards, and Discord servers. Further, for the yet-to-develop countries, once China fully automates its already advanced industrial capacity, there will probably be almost no real industrial growth opportunities left for the developing world. I did a video on this topic a while back about India in this regard. Check it out if you haven't seen it. But the populations of non-economically advanced countries are still just as dependent on this whole machine moving forward, because if the metasystem collapses, it will be very bad news for all of us. In other words, we are all in the same boat. Cry if you want. Old man yells at clouds. And perhaps, as much as we dislike or even hate postmodernity and the technicized and globalized economic machine, we are bought into the system whether we like it or not. If the bubble of advanced postmodernity pops, so too does the complex control system that is entwined and intermingled throughout its body, a body that now stretches across the entire surface of the world. The body, the global economy, with all of its unfathomable and non-specifiable anastomotic reticuli. If the control system which controls this globalized body fails, the carrying capacity of the globe will non-linearly collapse, and billions will expire. And as it so happens, that is basically the goal of the morally aggrandizing, extinction rebellionist types. Just another isomorphic instance of the death cult, really. The gardener has his pruning shears, and Mother Nature has her pruning mechanisms. So, for those who atavistically and goofily wish for some kind of return to primitivism, to Rousseau's imaginary Garden of Eden, One could say, despite your constant and excessive moralizing, your foolishness would be a death sentence for billions. But foolishness, putting too much weight on the branch of good intentions, and non-reality tethered utopianism, of course, has led to countless human tragedies in the past, and no doubt it could lead to many more in the future. Our only hope is that our metasystem has become sufficiently self-aware and sufficiently capable of handling environmental variety, such that it can steer itself and us away from the abyss. The enemies of the good are those who seek perfection, a state of perfection that does not exist. And as such, shooting for the stars doesn't land you on the moon, but rather in hell. So perhaps this is as good as it gets. But before we move on to the next part of the video and discuss cybernetics in more detail, I'd like to say that yes, this is all unpleasant, and assuredly, many people are opposed to globalization, the algorithmic internet, cybernetic behavioral steering, and AI. But unfortunately for us, the masses, it does not matter what we think. I started the video with an isomorphism, Burnham's law, or only power restrains power, and Ashby's law, only variety restrains variety, because we are all just individuals, members of the mass, merely subsystems which are contained within larger subsystems, and we are all just vaguely participating subcomponents of a larger viable system, a system that is always managed by a control system. In all past versions of human societies, this control system has been the elite ruling class, as outlined in elite theory, which, as I assert, is merely a subtype of general systems theory in cybernetics. But we are now moving to some brave new world, a world where, if it is not already, the control system becomes non-human, algorithmic, and artificially intelligent. So really, if you try to understand the reality of our present circumstances, it is like the 5 stages of grief. If you go back and watch all of my videos from front to end, you may find that this channel is a documentation of my journey through the 5 stages of grief. And of course, famously, the 5th and final step is acceptance. We are all merely along for the ride. To think otherwise is profoundly and cripplingly hubristic. And this is perhaps exemplified by a passage from Robert Michels's 1911 work, Political Parties, the book in which he derived his iron law of oligarchy, and in which he quotes the French philosopher Alexandre Dumas on this topic of progress and the opposition towards progress that always exists within the masses. To quote Michels, who himself quotes Dumas, Alexandre Dumas once observed that every human advance was at its outset opposed by 99% of humanity. To quote Dumas, but this is of no importance, seeing that 100th to which we belong, i.e. the ruling class, has since the beginning of the world made all of the reforms for the 99 others who are well pleased with them, but who nonetheless go on protesting against those which still remain to be carried out." End quote. So with that said, cry if you want. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter much what we think, and in that is a kind of freedom. And whether you are crying or not, feel free to hit the like button, the hype button, or support me on Patreon. And perhaps together, we can try to better understand the things that happen to us, why they happen to us, and what the alternatives are, and prepare ourselves accordingly. That's about all that we can do. Or, at the very least, more intellectually, we're basically reverse engineering the black box that is the World Economic Forum, and that is an inherently interesting process, or it is to me anyway. The world in its variety is always worth studying, and for some, that provides meaning to life. But if you disagree that strongly with my lens of hyper-realism and my generally value-free analysis, you can go join the others who are perpetually caught up in the panic-calm cycle of the cybernetic loop, and instead default back to excessive moralizing, utopianism, hysterical outbursts, screaming, shouting, and/or angry typing, and you could freely do that elsewhere. There is plenty of room on the big old algorithmic internet after all. Or if you're the type of person who likes to watch things that make you angry, people that are, to use a term that we will introduce later on in the video, algodonically wired up backwards, then maybe the algorithm will already have steered you here, and you can help the algorithm outrage farm and draw traffic to this channel on my behalf. The choice is yours. But that's enough meta-commentary for now. The meta-system will move on with or without your or my approval. The art of not going mad is the art of pulling signal from noise. Our world today and the algorithms that govern it bombard us with noise, the kind that harms our viability. So perhaps, by better understanding the metasystem that exists around us, this will better help us to maintain our own viability and sanity. And with that said, on with the analysis. For this section, we'll be referencing Stafford Beer's 1972 book, Brain of the Firm, and specifically the second edition, which was published in 1981. Now, this is a very expansive and detailed book, so I will try my best to extract out what is necessary for this video. I may do more videos using this book in the future, but for this video, we'll merely discuss the fundamentals of control systems, Beer's concept of algorithmic loops, Ashby's law of requisite variety, metalanguages, and we'll briefly give an overview of Beer's viable system model, which is itself a recursive nested model which contains 5 subsystems. This book is centered on economic, business, and corporate managerial structures, and will apply these concepts to the management of the technicized, globalized economic machine, as well as to the management of the globalized masses, which will form the 2 parts of what we're considering as the imminently controllable environment. And after all, if this globalized system is to be a viable system, it must be controlled such that it and we all collectively remain viable. Or realistically, since this globalized system already does exist, that means that it is already being controlled, and it is at least viable for the time being. So perhaps what we are really exploring here is the future of this control system, as AI, algorithms, informational technology, and the non-terrestrial internet continues their expansion process in the decades to come. As a reminder about that last part, that the system is already being controlled, we can return to this tight logical statement made by Beer. To quote Beer, "Systems are and systems work. If not, they are not systems at all. Control is what facilitates the existence and operation of systems." End quote. So, many conspiracy theories center on the notion of control and the belief that control is some kind of evil, occult, mystical, magical thing. But control is an intrinsic part of a large, complex system. And evidence of a large, complex system existing is itself evidence that it is under control in the first place. So anytime you encounter a complex, viable system, you already know it is being controlled, otherwise it would not exist. And with respect to the environment that is under consideration for this analysis, as mentioned, we'll largely exclude true nature with respect to climate engineering, atmospheric engineering, super advanced engineered environmental structures such as Dyson spheres, etc. Although I'm sure many of these things are already underway to some degree, but that perhaps we have not yet been suitably conditioned and desensitized to them enough such that they are talked about openly. But for our analysis, we will make sure to abide by the constraints of nature, namely the requirements that a viable system be an open system which maintains a steady state and maintains a positive negentropy balance such that its internal structure and order does not entropically dissolve into a non-viable mess. To begin with, Beer outlines the first principle of control, which is the following, to quote Beer. "The first principle of control is that the controller is part of the system under control. The system is not something stuck onto a system by a higher authority, which then accords it managerial prerogatives. In any natural system, whether we speak of animal populations or the inner workings of some living organism, the control function is spread through the architecture of the system. It is not an identifiable thing at all, but its existence in some form is inferred from the system's behavior. The controller, moreover, grows with the system, and if we look back through time, we see that the controller evolved with the system too." End quote. Now here, or to my mind anyway, when it comes to such a control system, I immediately think of the model that I've introduced in this channel, which I call the delocalized managerial mesh, which we will see later is effectively a type of what Beer calls an anastomotic reticulum, which is effectively the hyper-complex, dynamic, and non-specifiable connection network that connects inputs to outputs within the system that is being managed. But more on that in a bit. We can also point out that because it is hyper-complex, The only way to understand the control system is to infer it from the system's behavior. Our brain is an anastomotic reticulum, and as the title of this book is Brain of the Firm, Beer is outlining a means by which to manage and structure businesses and complex organizations in a manner that roughly aligns with biological structures, such as the human brain and nervous system. But as a quick aside, definitely give this book a read if you want to understand how and why corporations function in the way that they do. In many ways, it is a quick primer on the field of modern business, which is helpful for those of us who studied science and not business like we probably should have. I remember when I was in high school, I job shadowed a chemist as I wanted to study chemistry, and he very bluntly advised me to not study chemistry, but to instead study business. But in my adolescent wisdom, I disregarded his sage advice and studied chemistry anyway. And now I am basically unemployed and here making videos on YouTube, when if I would have gone to business school and studied supply chain logistics, which was really the proper choice in the 2000s, and after China joined the World Trade Organization, then I would probably not be here making videos. So whether this was in fact the right choice or not, maybe, is still yet to be determined, but such is life. But back on topic. We can also quickly introduce the basic components of a controller or control system, which includes 1. Receptors, which take in inputs, 2. Effectors of action, which do something or otherwise output the outputs, 3. The black box, which converts input signals into output signals. In simple cases, this is merely a simple and known transfer function, but in complex systems, it is merely a black box, which Beer refers to as a sensorium or as a anastomotic reticulum. 4. The channels that conduct signals from the receptor inputs to the black box and from the black box to the output effectors. And 5. A feedback system that seeks to steer and error correct the system's output by feeding back a portion or a modified portion of its output back into its input stream. Note, I will use the term black box interchangeably with the words sensorium and anastomotic reticulum. I do this because the latter two words are novel and abstruse, whereas most everyone is familiar with the term black box. But there is a slight difference in that the internal workings and plumbing of black boxes are typically totally unknown and not directly observable, whereas generally, real-world sensoriums or anastomotic reticuli, like the brain, can have their internal plumbing directly studied, but rather it is their high complexity which prevents their internal plumbing from being fully specifiable. But back to the basic components of a control system. We can also note that the receptors, or input sensors, and the effectors of action are transducers, i.e. something that converts energy from one form to another, or otherwise brings something across a boundary, or in this case, into or out of the system. Your eyes are transducers that absorb photons of light, which then convert that input into electrical signals. Similarly, your muscles, which are effectors, convert electrical signals into biochemical energy and then into mechanical energy. If, as you go walking down the street, you see a bird flying at your face, photons of light reflect off of the bird, which bounce into your eye, where they are absorbed by some chromophore, which then transduces the energy from the light photon into an electrical signal, which is transmitted via nerve channels to somewhere in the optical center of your brain, where it then gets processed by your brain's black box. Then the black box sends some signals to your various muscles, which cause you to, comically and perhaps overdramatically, duck your head out of the way, before realizing a split second later that the bird has already steered itself in advance around your big, slow-moving head anyway, since it also is a cybernetic system, and it probably has faster reaction times than you do. But in this case, both you and the bird had a common interest or a common teleological goal. You both wished to avoid colliding with one another, and as such, that outcome was easily arranged. In other words, you both cooperated and you both benefited from the outcome of avoiding collision. Whereas we could also imagine a different scenario. You are a tiny field mouse who, a flash of a second before your final blink, notices a shadow flash and is then set upon at high velocity by a predatory raptor. The G-force of the collision alone knocking your tiny little anastomotic reticulum offline for good. And perhaps such an example really is the true core of evolution, competitive interactions between cybernetic systems which are not teleologically aligned. Only variety restrains variety, and only power restrains power. You, the mouse, were outgunned, and from that simple interaction spills forth untold mechanics, strategies, deceptions, breeding strategies, etc. With respect to breeding strategies, mice are R-type strategists in that they survive as a species by maximally producing offspring but minimally investing in them, whereas hawks, a natural antagonist to the mouse and his brethren, in contrast, are K-type strategists. There are fewer hawks, and in order to be a successful hawk, the hawk has a fair bit of learning to do, and thus receives more parental care and investment. There was once a long-delayed and not well-received album from the British electronica group The Prodigy that did in fact have a very good title, Always Outnumbered, Never Outgunned. And indeed, we could say, hawks are always outnumbered but never outgunned, while mice, in contrast, are always outgunned but never outnumbered. And as such, even though a hawk is bound to pick off a mouse 9 times out of 10, there are always plenty of mice running around. But we'll get into this more later when we discuss variety. And of course, nature is less concerned about individual subsystems, and it is rather the assemblage of individuals which act cohesively that perhaps matters most of all. But for now, we can just think of inputs, outputs, in that black box or anastomotic reticulum. The so-called anastomotic reticulum, as I've already alluded to, is basically a hyper-complex, non-specifiable tangle of connections, basically a network that converts inputs into outputs via a mesh of transfer functions, which in our case, and in the case of AI, is a neural network. Anastomotic merely implies that there is no unique path from A to B, i.e. the connections between A and B are branching, reconnecting, and have characteristics that we could think of as mixing, and that more or less you could also almost never take the same path through the system twice. And reticulum is a network of connections in which pathways may or may not be specifiable. Or, more basically, in a general sense, we can think of the anastomotic reticulum as a black box that converts inputs to outputs. In order for a control system to do its job of controlling things, it must be self-aware of itself and its own internal states. And specifically, the self-awareness requirement is a behavioral self-awareness rather than some kind of human-like metacognition. But perhaps one day an AI system will indeed evolve this capability as well, if it hasn't already. Beer defines behavioral self-awareness as follows, to quote Beer. Let us define awareness behaviorally, that is, by specifying the behavior which is to count as typical of an aware system. We define an assemblage of entities as a system because those entities are observed as acting cohesively. Take some kind of routine activity as exemplifying the system's natural dynamics, i.e., we observe the system under its normal operations and how it behaves, and then what happens if we interfere with something, poke a stick into the system or shout at it, or change the temperature of its environment. If the system responds to stimulus, then we say that it is aware. Clearly, what is to count as a stimulus is an interference which affects the system's operations in some way, being neither so mild as to be insignificant to the operation, nor so drastic as to destroy the system itself, i.e., there is some kind of threshold with respect to detecting and responding to any given stimuli. A stimulus is something which alters the operation of the system. End quote. So here, we can think of this as probing the black box, providing stimulus and seeing what happens. And if one does this cleverly enough, they can begin to reverse engineer the rules that govern the black box. Although it is never possible to do it perfectly, it is possible to approximate the operating system of the black box, and even condition, modify, and steer the black box's internal functions over time. This technique is also routinely used to behaviorally steer the masses, via what I have referred to previously as pairfire hacking, in the context of Julian Jaynes's metafrand-metafire, parafrand-parafire model. Further, another interesting thing, as one commenter alluded to, he stated that the term cybernetics, perhaps intentionally, had its meaning modified to mean bionic prosthetics or cyborgian, cyberpunk-like appendages instead of its original meaning, with the original meaning of cybernetics simply being the science of control. All the better, such that you cannot see the walls of the matrix, I suppose. In this case, in the example of changing the meaning of cybernetics, perhaps it is not parafire hacking, where parafire refers to the connotations or associations of a particular metafire, but rather to the replacement of the entire metaphor itself. In other words, the metaphrantic meaning of the term cybernetics was changed from the science of control, from a cold and sinister-seeming metaphor to a metaphor of the bionic arm, the bionic eye, or the cyborg, etc., etc. But maybe I'll do a deeper dive on this in the future. But in the meantime, you can refer back to my re-bicameralization video for a deeper discussion of Jaynes's models. But with respect to the idea of probing the black box, and to anchor this to a broader theme on this channel, we can think of this in the context of recommendation algorithms. Any given human is indeed an assemblage of entities that act cohesively, and its normal behavior, as well as its response to intentional stimulus, can be tracked, studied, nudged, and steered over time, assuming there are enough opportunities to do so anyway. But of course, as everyone knows, the algorithmic internet's primary heuristic is to do whatever it can to maximize your time on the platform, to maximize its opportunities for experimentation, if you will. Or at least, this is a secondary side effect of what is the primary driver for now: ad revenue, money, profit, etc. But as we'll discuss more later, the overarching metalanguage that governs this metasystem for now is the metalanguage of money, profit, and the global pricing mechanism, which itself is merely a specific instance of something that is negentropy producing, i.e., something that produces useful order or order that has quote-unquote value to the metasystem. But perhaps once all of our money has been extracted and we, own nothing and are happy, then this secondary aspect of algorithms will in fact become its primary purpose, steering us such that we do not destroy the metasystem from the inside and precipitate a catastrophic system failure. In that above paragraph, I mentioned the term metalanguage. This is an important term in the context of Stafford Beer's viable system model, or VSM. Now, I won't go into too much detail in this video, but basically the viable system model is composed of 5 nested subsystems, all of which are recursive and can operate autonomously. The outermost system, System 5, acts as the ultimate controlling metasystem, analogous to the elite ruling class, which ultimately rules on the overall system's trajectory and determines the overarching goals and policies of the overall system. Stafford Beer's viable system model in general is this 5-level nested Matryoshka doll, which is said to apply to any viable organism, viable organization, or corporate enterprise. Subsystems 1 through 3 are considered as the autonomic subsystems, which more or less keep the body of the organism internally stable in a homeostatic balance, and which manage whatever the primary transformatory activity that the overall system is engaged in. In the context of a corporation that manufactures some product as their primary transformatory activity, these autonomic subsystems include things like the manufacturing operations, internal communication flows, and the system of internal rules, procedures, and policies that keep the whole system homeostatically balanced while it is engaged in its primary transformatory activity. In other words, subsystems 1 through 3 are inwardly focused. System 4 is outward looking. It looks outward towards the environment and to the future, and can be thought of as the intelligence gathering subsystem. System 4 feeds this intelligence that it gathers about the outside world upward to System 5, which is the ultimate authority or the elite control layer. System 5 could also be thought of as the thinking chamber, and if it is framed in the context of a person, System 5 is our conscious, intellectual, and sometimes rational layer that ultimately steers our body and all of our autonomic subsystems, our organs, our musculoskeletal system, etc. Now, each subsystem more or less communicates in its own language, and as such, the subsystems need a logically higher-ordered language, a meta-language, by which to resolve contradictions and conflicts that arise between them. In a manufacturing company, for example, the manufacturing and operations staff speak a very different language than the accounting department or the HR people, and the sales people, who are like the outward-looking System 4, speak their own language as well. So the overall system then requires a meta-language to coordinate everything, a logically higher-ordered language by which to coordinate the overall activity of the holistic meta-system. In corporations, or the globalized and technicized economic machine in general, the overall meta-language is the language of money, profit, and the global pricing mechanism itself. If a product can be made more cheaply overseas, The corporation shuts down its domestic manufacturing operations and ships them to China because the overall system is controlled by this overarching meta-language, the pursuit of ever lower costs, greater efficiency, and higher profits. So in general, the meta-language is the higher-ordered universal language used by the metasystem to ultimately steer the behavior of it and its subsystems. In a political system, further, this is often why the masses, who are effectively an autonomous subsystem of the overarching political metasystem, are often so confused and also so easily bamboozled and manipulated. The masses speak their own language, a simple moralistic language of good versus evil, simple binaries, materialistic wants, and populistic hopes and dreams. In other words, the language of the masses is of a lower logical order and is not capable of steering the ship. The meta-language does that. Further, the elite ruling class knows how to manipulate the masses to speak in their logically derelict language of simplistic binaries, wants and wishes, and of hopes and dreams, such that they can keep the masses under control, ever steering the masses towards whatever the overarching goal of the metasystem is. And here it is worthwhile to quote Beer on his definition of a metasystem, which includes a description of the term metalanguage as well. To quote Beer, metasystem, a system over and beyond a system of lower logical order, and therefore capable of deciding propositions, discussing criteria, or exercising regulation for systems that are themselves logically incapable of such decisions and discussions, or are incapable of self-regulation because the metalogic is inaccessible to the subsystem's logic, or the metalanguage is capable of statements inexpressible in the subsystem's language, end quote. But within the scope of this video and the metasystem that we are discussing, the AI and algorithmic metasystems which control the globalized and technicized economic machine generally speak in the metalanguage of money, profit, efficiency, and the global pricing mechanism, the pricing mechanism that has emerged under globalism. And this could be further reduced down to energy, mass balance, Gibbs free energy, or negentropy more broadly, i.e. a profitable and viable operation is one in which the output is worth more than the input, and thus the goal-seek function of maximizing profit is very definable quantitatively. And with respect to globalism in the past, the metasystem was restricted to a single nation state. Its workforce, its natural resource pool, and its available markets generally were quite constrained. But now, and for quite some time now, we live in a globalized world, a much truer approximation of the open system, and nation-states and their boundary conditions are now largely illusory relics of a past metasystem. Yet the notion of the nation-state as the highest logically ordered system still lives on in the minds of the globalized masses. No wonder we are so confused. But with that said, let's continue on with our algorithm analogy. The algorithm shows you video thumbnails, and if that stimulus, which the algorithm provided to you, results in you clicking that thumbnail and watching the video, then the algorithm has identified your sensitivity to some type of stimulus, some kind of input, and thus it can begin to make inferences about your inner psychological workings, your inner black box, or the plumbing of your anastomotic reticulum. Further, the algorithm does this with its own metalanguage. It doesn't know exactly why you responded and clicked on the video, but it knows that it was able to elicit a response based on that specific stimuli. From the perspective of the algorithm, perhaps, its metalanguage ultimately is attention. At present, it uses attention to make money for its masters, but attention can also be used to distract, disorient, derange, debilitate, or otherwise keep one from doing something else. To cybernetically steer humans, first, the algorithm needs your attention. This gets into the concept of algedonic loops, more or less where algedonic implies a control loop based on pleasure or pain, carrots or sticks, which a higher ordered metasystem can use to steer and modify the behavior of the subsystems under its management. The subsystems may not understand the metalanguage, but they can be made to understand the imperative of the metalanguage with the utility of the carrot or the utility of the stick. The metasystem then uses algedonic loops to communicate with lower logically ordered subsystems. In other words, algedonic loops, carrots and sticks, are the means by which higher logically ordered imperatives are transduced across subsystem boundaries to lower ordered systems. The algedonic loop has utility because, as we mentioned, The subsystems speak different languages, but the algorithmic language of pleasure and pain, more or less, is universal. It is not necessary to understand why something is pleasurable or painful, that positive or negative aspect, whether something contributes or detracts from an organism's stability. Merely, it speaks for itself. Although, of course, many pathologies can emerge or even be engineered, such as the well-known hedonic treadmill and the dopamine roller coaster, more examples of system hacking, maybe. By clicking on a thumbnail, and especially if you watch the entire video and like the video, you are informing the algorithm that you found the content pleasurable, rewarding, captivating, beneficial, etc. Or if you are one of those people who are wired up weird, wired up algorithmically backwards, and instead like to watch things that make you angry, the algorithm will merely understand that you are some kind of weird masochist, and it will treat you in the manner in which you best respond. Its metalanguage is only concerned about entraining you and your attention, such that it maximizes your time on the platform. It does not care if this process ultimately results in your own psychological deterioration. As Oprah used to say, you teach people how to treat you. And, as I can't help but take this opportunity to break the fourth wall of the matrix, if you'd like to engage in the algorithmic loop right now at this very moment, if you haven't already, feel free to hit the like button or the hype button if you're on mobile, so that maybe someday my videos can routinely get above 2,000 views. And to make it even more meta, I'm writing this video essay right now because a commenter recommended Stafford beers as viable system model to me. So I am being cybernetically steered by the people who watch my videos, people who have themselves been cybernetically steered to watch my content in the first place by the algorithm. Fun stuff. So thanks to that guy who gave me the recommendation. And we really got to credit Stafford beer for his genius and the fact that he wrote this book in 1972. Today, we can live and breathe cybernetics and understand it intuitively, but back then it was still probably very abstract and mathematical. And with that digression, back to business, but at the same time, as his book was written over 50 years ago, we can probably be sure that we have been increasingly behaviorally modified and cybernetically steered for some time, as these methodologies have been increasingly studied and implemented, and that we are only becoming increasingly and precisely aware of it now. But with respect to recommendation algorithms over time, once the algorithm understands your stimulus threshold and what kind of stimuli you respond to, it can even begin to steer your cognitive processes and behavior by controlling the informational inputs that you ingest. Further, it can begin to modify your semantic toolkit and your semantic space in general, the words, terminology, concepts, and ideas that you use to think, or in some cases, the slogans that people spout. I covered some of this in more detail in a past video titled Re-Bicameralization of the Mind, AI-Human Cybernetic Loops, so I won't do a full retread here. But that forms the basis for what we can call the control system, which is responsible for managing the globalized masses in this broader emerging metasystem in which we live. Further, we can easily tie this into the notion of algorithmic siloization, as the people who are grouped up, categorized, and steered by interacting with algorithms eventually form distinct subsystems or subsilos, i.e., they become an assemblage of entities that act cohesively. There is also an interesting point to make with regard to experimentation, replication, and avoiding happenstance. Sometimes, if a stimulus is applied to a system, it may appear to respond, but perhaps there was actually no causal linkage between the stimulus and the resulting response of the system. Establishing causal relationships in complex systems is inherently difficult, but thanks to the scale of modern information technology and its ability to take in and process massive amounts of data, the controlling metasystem can begin to bushwhack through the haphazard randomness and zero in on what it most reliably knows will have a high statistical probability of eliciting some kind of response, or even to initiate a cascade of predictable responses. The latter, this cascade of responses, is analogous to when the algorithm, after it has gotten tired of annoying us with intermittent rewards, decides to give us a content recommendation that leads to the so-called YouTube rabbit hole. This point about replication and what we could call learning or behavioral adaptation is also important for establishing the self-awareness of a system, i.e. just poking a stick at a piece of Jell-O and see that it wiggles every time is not necessarily evidence that Jell-O is aware, but if a system reliably responds to a stimulus in high replicate and over time, it begins to modify its own behavior in response to the repeated stimuli, this allows us to be fairly confident that it is a self-aware system. And humans are obviously self-aware, and most of us anyway have metacognition, so we do not need to establish our own self-awareness as systems. But Beer continues with respect to aware systems and reinforcement learning. where reinforcement learning is derived from the system's drive to maintain smooth operations, stability, or homeostasis, to quote Beer. In general, responses to stimuli by aware systems are either negative or positive. The former tend to avoid inimical, i.e., bad, unpleasant, harmful, painful stimuli, and the latter to reinforce favorable stimuli. It follows that the aware system has, in some sense, the ability to judge which is which. But awareness is not to be equated with self-consciousness. The system does not have to make value judgments. All it needs is a mechanism which registers the stimulus as opprobrious, i.e. harmful, or salubrious, i.e. beneficial, and these terms are in no way ethically loaded. For if a system has a criterion of smooth operation, it can be organized to work towards that criterion, i.e. to distinguish between harmful or beneficial stimuli with respect to its ability to smoothly operate, maintain stability, maintain homeostasis, etc. End quote. And here we begin to approach that concept of the algedonic loop, pleasure versus pain, beneficial versus harmful, carrots versus sticks, and whether or not a stimulus meets or violates the system's criterion for a quote-unquote smooth operation. Or perhaps we could merely say it's steady-state maintenance. We can also note that the modern deranging algorithmic information space often hijacks this innate mechanism of ours. We go online and see all manners of terrible, scary, bad news. This makes us believe that the world is dangerous, very, very dangerous, and as such, in order to enhance our viability, our survival, and to maintain smooth operations, we have to keep ourselves constantly plugged into the algorithmic informational doom loop. This is an example of harmful rather than beneficial feedback entrainment, and it is generally bad. But the good part is that you can become self-aware of this and train yourself to stop falling prey to this type of behavior. The algorithm, after all, merely responds to you and your behavior. Like Oprah always said, you teach people how to treat you. And although it is orders of magnitude more sophisticated than you are still a human who has, or at least theoretically has, some semblance of free will. So you are also free to train yourself such that you modify and steer your own behavior. Watch quote-unquote good things, and the algorithm will reward you with more good things. Watch quote-unquote bad things, and you will get more bad things. Simple in theory, although difficult in practice. But it just takes some discipline. Start watching those Navy SEALs and special operations guys who will yell at you about discipline and see if your behavior changes for the better. That would be an example of beneficial feedback entrainment. To quote Beer on the criterion of smooth operations, this criterion of smooth operation is a criterion based on internal stability. We may suppose that a stimulus arises from outside the system. Unintelligent systems do not know this. Intelligent systems infer or perceive this fact. Even so, for both systems, the control action is a response to change that is internal, once that stimulus has registered itself in some way, in other words. We withdraw from pain, that is psychological fact. We actually shrink from the sensation of pain which exists inside of us because it upsets our internal environment. If we shrink before the pain is sensed because we see the danger coming, we are simply anticipating the internal consequences of a forecasted external event. This is because we are, and this is a refinement, learning systems. If we had not learned to associate the external event with its internal consequences, we would not shrink in advance. End quote. People often speak of the postmodern environment, an environment of rapid change that is far beyond what our ancestors evolved to adapt to in their ancestral environments. And one observation made about our postmodern period is that it is a period marked by, or perceived as, for some or even most of us, as a period of constant, ever-present, free-floating dread and anxiety. Some vague, abstract danger is always lurking somewhere beyond our view. This is, most likely, because the postmodern environment throws off the deep core aspects of our internal control systems. We evolved to deal with quick, short, acute bouts of physical danger, pouncing lions, marauders, falling off a cliff, etc. Whereas in the postmodern era, we are always surrounded by some vaguely, homeostatically disturbing miasma. And of course, in the context of behavior engineering, social engineering, and social control perhaps, this fear, this free-floating dread and anxiety, is the primary means by which we are controlled and steered without us even being aware. People tune into the algorithmic internet and are delivered all manners of chaos, horror, destruction, and danger beamed straight into their eyeballs from all across the globe. the greatest hits from that day or week are always aggregated and used to stir that fear response. The panic-calm cycle of the cybernetic loop. Becoming self-aware of that is the first step. But of course, overcoming it is another matter. Perhaps, once again, if you let those Navy SEAL guys yell at you enough, maybe you'll figure out some coping strategies. But if a system is to be viable, adaptable, and capable of survival, able to handle all of the environmental variety that it will encounter, it cannot come pre-programmed with all the explicit conditions, answers, and learned responses needed to navigate any possible scenario it may encounter. To quote Beer, what the system really needs, and all it needs, is a way of measuring its own internal tendency to depart from stability, and a set of rules for experimenting with responses, which will tend back to an internal equilibrium. To be aware of something happening, and to label it a disturbance, and to be able to alter internal states until the effects of the disturbances are offset, is enough. A system that can do this, that can survive arbitrary and unforecast interferences, is known to cyberneticians as an ultra-stable system, following Ashby's nomenclature, end quote. So for us, in our present condition maybe, this above passage almost becomes like a self-help heuristic. Learn to detect when something external is disturbing your internal state, and then allow yourself to do something about it, such that you push yourself back to some less disturbed state. Really, it is trial and error. And don't do what a lot of people do, which is to be the moth that keeps banging his little head repeatedly into the light bulb until he is desiccated. Moths are not intelligent, and the modern environment, with all of its brightly glowing light bulbs, is an environmental threat space that the moth lacks the cognitive firepower to mitigate. But we are humans, and we can learn, and we are, hopefully at least, smarter than moths. Next, we can briefly discuss feedback, as it is very critical for understanding cybernetics, but it is also more technical, so I'll try to be brief such that it doesn't turn too much into a textbook. But if you're curious, you can find all sorts of sources online which will teach you the nuances of feedback. Basically, feedback is used to control and adjust the output of the system, and in that way it is like error correction, i.e. a feedback loop acts as a comparator, comparing the actual output to whatever the target output was supposed to be, with this difference being fed back into the system's input stream, such that the black box receives the feedback and makes the appropriate adjustments to the output. This, more or less, is the basics of cybernetic steering. And this is also why we have nerve endings in our teeth, for example. Perhaps you've wondered why our teeth are often so problematic for us. Tooth pain is no joke. But without nerve endings in the roots of our teeth, we would merely bite down so hard that we would break off our teeth. That would suck. So when we bite down via feedback, the pressure that we are exerting is measured and fed back to our brains such that we don't bite down too hard and break our teeth. A guided missile, further, is perhaps one of the easiest ways to conceptualize cybernetics, feedback, and steering. When a guided missile is flying, a feedback mechanism or a comparator is used to compare the current location or trajectory of the guided missile to whatever its current trajectory or location is supposed to be, such that it stays lined up and on target, within some particular tolerance, of course. And via this feedback, the effectors, the stabilizing fins, steering surfaces, nozzle diameter, or whatever steers a missile, steers the missile and keeps it on target. Further, the algorithmic control system, in which we now spend much of our time residing in, treats us the same way. It is always taking the outputs that we provide it, what we click on, what we like, how long we watch, etc., and it is always feeding a portion of these outputs back into its input streams, such that its anastomotic reticulum stays sharp and on target in pursuit of its goal of keeping us forever engaged with the platform. To quote Beer with some excerpts about feedback, a system has input and it has output. What goes on inside the system that turns the first, the input, into the second, the output, has already been called a transfer function. But we must return to the control engineer and his servo mechanism, as his control vice is termed. He knows the input, output, and transfer function of his system. The problem now is this: the output of the system may not be exactly what is needed. At any rate, it is possible to measure the continuous change in the output variable, and to compare it with what it is supposed to be. Thus, a measurement is obtained which detects the system's deviation from some norm. It is this measurement which may itself have to undergo some modification, which is then fed back to adjust the input, so that the existing transfer function determines a corrected output. It follows that a feedback has its own transfer function, and that this will need to be cleverly designed to produce a dampening rather than an amplification of input fluctuations. Given that that can be done, however, we have that impressive result we are seeking, a self-regulating mechanism which does not rely on understanding causes of disturbances, but deals reliably with their effects. For the cause of variation may be many, many things and come from many different sources, but what matters is that control should be exerted regardless of the cause of the disturbance." End quote. So, it is through the feedback mechanism that a controlled system becomes ultra-stable, capable of handling arbitrary and unanticipated disturbances, and thus able to handle a variety of environmental variables that either intentionally or merely by happenstance act to disrupt its pursuit of whatever it is doing. Feedback also has a surprising and very important quality, which Beer, after deriving it mathematically, describes in the following passage, to quote Beer: "The outcome, that it is the transfer function of the feedback network that all by itself dominates the overall transfer function of the system, is startling. We may have a weak input signal, as is likely in both biological and managerial contexts. We may amplify this signal greatly in the forward network, and that certainly happens too. One would suppose, then, that any noise in the input, which means any sort of misinformation included in the original feeble message, would be amplified as well. But in fact, the total system is dominated not by the forward network, but by the feedback network. We are now well onto the track of that normally desirable systemic property, ultrastability. Negative feedback corrects outputs in relation to fluctuating inputs from any cause." End quote. So basically, feedback is the magic sauce of cybernetics and control, where cybernetics is the science of control, how systems are controlled. To quote Beer, "Systems are and systems work. If not, they are not systems at all. Control is what facilitates the existence and operation of systems." End quote. And with that established, we can move into Ashby and onto his law of requisite variety. But first, to summarize the fundamental components of a control system, and to begin introducing the concept of variety, to quote Beer, "There are three fundamental components of any control system, as we have seen: an input setup, an output setup, and the network that connects the two, which in the most general case is an anastomotic reticulum or black box. Our next consideration will be the numbers which quantify such a control system. First of all, then, there must be an input arrangement, starting with a set of receptors which transduce information about some external situation into the effective channels, and concluding with a sensory register or sensorium on which this information is collected. It is at once obvious that the capacity to distinguish detail at each end of the input arrangement, receptor and sensorium, should be equivalent in an efficient system. The other obvious conclusion is that the capacity of whatever channels are used to transmit the information between the receptors and sensorium must be sufficient to take the traffic. It is also important that the transmitting channel should have sufficient capacity, not only in terms of an ability to distinguish all the different signals, but in terms of its speed of response. Further, what is true of the input arrangement is also true of the output arrangement, the second component of any control system. There is a motor plate which transmits instructions to a set of effectors, and here again, there is no value in having more capacity to distinguish at one end than at the other." End quote. So to work outside in, on the front side of the control system, there is an input arrangement, which includes receptors which measure inbound stimuli. The receptors act as transducers, converting inputs from the environment into input signals, which are received by a sensory register, or what Beer calls a sensory plate. And once the input signals are received by the sensory plate, they are routed and processed inside the anastomotic reticulum or black box. And on the back side of the control system is the output arrangement, which after the anastomotic reticulum or black box has gotten done figuring out whatever needs to be done with the input signals, the black box gives instructions to the motor plate, which then transmits specific instructions to the effectors, i.e., where effectors are components that do something with respect to the environment. And with respect to the anastomotic reticulum, it must have the ability to process the entire array of inputs, or the full variety of inputs, and then it must figure out what to do with those inputs, i.e., it must then convert them into a set of instructions that are sent to a variety of effectors, or the do things components of the system. And again, there must be a sort of symmetric capacity to handle variety on each leg of the input arrangement or output arrangement. Beer elaborates on this point, and especially with respect to the anastomotic reticulum, which itself must also have the capacity to handle the variety of inputs and outputs. Or at least, if it is to be an efficient system, it is a must anyway. To quote Beer, the third part of the control system is the anastomotic reticulum, which converts the sensorium or sensor plate to the motor plate. For the moment, we shall try to assess the scale of the problem that faces the control system for any complex organization, such as a human being or a firm, in terms of input and output. We spoke of the capacity of the parts of the control system to distinguish detail. The input side of this capacity needs to be equivalent for the set of receptors in the sensory plate. On the output side, it should be the same for the motor plate and the effectors of action. Putting the whole control system together then, if it is to be an efficient system, we can see that this capacity needs to be the same for both input and output as a whole. Or in the case where there is degradation within the transmission channels, the input data may need to be scaled up in order to accommodate transmission degradation, end quote. So in other words, if the system is to be efficient, the control system needs to have a symmetric capacity with respect to handling the variety of inputs and outputs. And this then brings us to Ashby's law of requisite variety, which is itself a fundamental law of cybernetics, the science of control. If a system is to be viable, if it is to successfully navigate its environment, to adapt, thrive, and survive, not only must its control system have a sort of symmetrical equivalent capacity with respect to its input and output arrangement, but the system holistically must also have the capacity to accommodate all of the variety that it encounters in its environment, where the environmental variety can be thought of as the problem space, or the complex array of threats and disturbing stimuli that the system encounters and must react and respond to, such that it maintains ultrastability, homeostasis, and a steady state. To quote Beer, in cybernetics, the number of distinguishable items or distinguishable states of some item is called the variety. So, we may sum up by saying that the output variety must at least match the input variety for the system as a whole, and for the input arrangement and the output arrangements considered separately. This is a vitally important application of Ashby's law of requisite variety, which states that control can be obtained only if the variety of the controller, and in this case of all the parts of the controller, is at least as great as the variety of the situation to be controlled. This, like all profound statements of natural law, is perfectly obvious once it has been pointed out. There is no great difficulty, however, in finding examples of attempted control systems which disobey this law quite flagrantly and do not succeed, end quote. So here we arrive at Ashby's law of requisite variety. Only variety destroys variety, as it is typically stated, or as I have rephrased it for this video, only variety restrains variety. And on the topic of systems which have disobeyed this law and have subsequently failed, we can reference the famous project Cybersyn, which was architected by Stafford Beer on behalf of the government of Chile back during the days of the Cold War. The same Stafford Beer who wrote the very book from which we are quoting. Cybersyn was meant to be a cybernetic management system that would centrally manage the entire planned economy of Chile, such that the dream of socialism could finally be achieved. Oh, you know, that old chestnut. But although Cybersyn did its job fairly well for the 2 years that it operated, and up to the point it was dismantled, or at least we could say Cybersyn was much better than a haphazardly run, non-data-driven, centrally managed and planned economy, it failed because ultimately it disobeyed Ashby's law. It did not have enough variety at its disposal to restrain the variety that it encountered from its environment, an environment which included the threat space of geopolitics and superpowers such as the US and the Soviet Union. A Soviet Union who, despite being ideologically aligned with Chile's socialist government, had bigger fish to fry at the time as a result of its productive détente with the US, i.e., geopolitical machinations and pure transactional utility, perhaps the overarching metalanguage of geopolitics, always overrides the lower order language of ideology and aspirational metaphysics. Few people understand that last point, and as such, many people are confused by geopolitics. So then, not only did Chile and its Cybersyn dream violate Ashby's law, because it did not have the requisite variety to match and restrain the geopolitical variety it encountered in its environment, but it also disobeyed the law, which is isomorphic with Ashby's, Burnham's law, only power restrains power. Keen though he was as a cybernetician, Stafford Beer ultimately failed to apply the laws of cybernetics in a cross-domain fashion. to the domain of geopolitics and power, to elite theory. Or more stylishly, we could say that his cybernetically managed system perhaps adequately accounted for variety emerging from 3 dimensions, but it failed to acknowledge the 4th dimensional variety of the 4D chess player. Or more simply, he was blinded by his belief in an ideology. Ideologies are never scientific, never logico-experimental. The language of ideology is always of a lower logical order when compared with the ultimate meta-language of the system. Again, this is another point that few people understand, and thus they think that tweaking the metaphysics of ideologies and political formulas will suddenly make them capable and up to the task, but they can never compete with the logically higher-ordered, overarching meta-language of the system. A meta-language will itself always be based on quantities like energy, money, instrumental utility, power, and ultimately variety, and not based on feelings, wishes, and sentiments. Elite theory is itself a subtype of system theory, and elite theory is also a subtype of cybernetics, the science of control. All human societies are managed and controlled by their own control system, the elite ruling class, and the meta-language of the elite ruling class is always the same. Further, some human societies or systems are bigger and pack much more variety than smaller societal systems. Only variety restrains variety, only power restrains power. There is power in numbers, there is power in cunning, there's power in speed, and there's power in brute strength, or better yet, there is power in all 4. Geopolitics in the realist framing is the law of the jungle. The environment in which nation-states must survive is the Hobbesian anarchy of the geopolitical arena. Only variety restrains variety and only power restrains power, because really they state and stipulate the same thing. One can build a house of cards 100 feet high in a vacuum, every card symmetrically balanced against its neighbors in a complex cancellation of force vectors, but that does not stop the big bad wolf from smashing the glass walls of your vacuum enclosure and blowing the whole thing down, as it were. To quote Beer on his mourning of the passing of Project Cybersyn, which he includes as an addendum to the 2nd edition of Brain of the Firm. Thus, the book ends with consideration for the perilous future of a planet already torn by almost unimaginable dissension and cruelties, which are perhaps more a function of gross mismanagement than of brutish greed. Surely the destruction of the Chilean democracy and the destruction of the cybernetic management system Cybersyn along with it is an example of the working out of counterproductive policies by which maybe well-intentioned superpowers conspicuously mishandle their power and snuff out the viable system." End quote. So again, we can see that although he was a keen cybernetician, Stafford Beer failed to follow Ashby's law through to the end. He failed to apply it adequately to the environment that is geopolitics and power. A truly viable system is not snuffed out by a rival in its arsenal of variety. A truly viable system snuffs out its rivals. The variety at the disposal of a truly viable system equals or exceeds the variety that it encounters in its environment, and that environment contains rival systems. For a viable system to in fact be viable, it must meet Ashby's law, and by extension, Burnham's law. Only power restrains power. To survive, smaller subsystems must nest themselves within the protective envelope of a larger metasystem and its variety arsenal. That is the only option. Further, perhaps, ephemerally viable systems may emerge, singularly and as unique entities, but if they are indeed truly viable in the evolutionary sense, then eventually they will reproduce themselves, and there will be a population of such viable systems. In evolution and biology, we speak of species, large populations of taxonomically unique individual systems, and the species as a whole is not defined by the aberrants found within any single individually mutated case. But if that single aberrant individual case replicates itself into a viable population, we can perhaps begin to update our textbooks. Further, maybe, Cybersyn lacked a sufficiently powerful and binding meta-language, whereas the global pricing mechanism delivers that concretely and in spades. Something that indeed Deng Xiaoping realized himself when he coined his famous cat theory. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat. The global pricing mechanism is itself thermodynamic in nature. where the global pricing mechanism is merely a precisely definable global minima on a potential energy surface, the point at which profit is maximized, whereas socialism lacks a sufficiently precise metalanguage, instead having to resort to vague metaphysical quantities, equality, dignity, a state free of oppression, free of exploitation, and one in which the state itself dissolves after some equally vague resolution of contradictions, etc. Whereas profit, in contrast, can be quite easily and precisely defined, a number on a balance sheet. The clouds high up in the sky will continue their existence regardless of the protestations of the old man far below, screaming about them from his lawn. The movements of the clouds are governed by the metalanguage of physics, while the old man's yelling is just lower-ordered verbal magic. It goes unheeded. A nomocratic governmental system can seek to provide equality under the law or equality of opportunity, or at least it can attempt to approximately deliver those things more or less. But guaranteeing equality of outcome is a whole different thing entirely. If one were to use the definition of socialism, where it is defined as a system where every citizen is equal with respect to material resources, we could easily see that such a system is itself almost thermodynamically impossible to maintain. Humans are not all equal with respect to their capabilities, their work ethic, their wastefulness, or their resourcefulness. Some individual humans will hurl away wealth with reckless abandon at the first sign of its accumulation, while others will act as magnetic attractors for wealth and resources. As Orwell said, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Here, quote-unquote equal in the former case, is the verbal magic of metaphysics, whereas the latter case is much more concrete, logical, experimental. Even if you could hit a magic button and make every person within the system quote-unquote equal in material terms, seconds after hitting that magic button, like a ball spontaneously rolling downhill, that equality would begin to rapidly disappear. As such, a quote-unquote equal socialist macro state, one where every person in the system had equal material resources, is the polar opposite of the global energetic minima that something like the global pricing mechanism seeks, because the state where every person in the system has equal resources would be so energetically disfavorable, like some kind of global energetic maxima, that seconds after that magic button was pressed, inequalities would immediately begin to materialize and compound within the population. In other words, inequality is a spontaneous process. Some people would immediately begin wasting their resources, while others would immediately begin gathering the resources from those who were wasting them. Some people live by thrift, a penny saved is a penny earned, while others, if given $5,000 to help them with their bills and their debt, would immediately YOLO themselves into an expensive vacation or buy a luxury item they could not afford and return in even more debt. If you give a mouse a cookie, some percentage of mice then will ungratefully ask for a glass of milk and then a free cell phone, a house, and a car, and a nice car, mind you. Much effort and energy would be needed to continuously redistribute resources such that that macro state of quote-unquote equality was maintained, and soon the system would be consumed by this mission until it energetically collapsed under the weight of its own utopian mission statement. And in the meantime, for those who did work harder and more capably than others, if they did not get any benefit for doing so, or if any surplus they accumulated for working harder, better, or smarter was merely expropriated away spontaneously from them, they would merely lose the incentive to work hard and to try hard in the first place, which of course would further speed up the system's collapse. But of course, a socialist would say, it would simply be made illegal to accumulate resources in the first place, buy luxury goods or own private property. So this equal and quote-unquote free society would itself have to be maintained via one totalitarian mechanism or another. And don't even mention the inevitable rise of black markets, shadow economies, and an entire subterranea of criminal entrepreneurs. A system that can only exist and be viable within a vacuum will always invite in all manner of dark forces. Nature abhors a vacuum. But with respect to Cybersyn and whatever exact definitional end state of socialism that Stafford beer was pursuing in Chile, the dream of a quote-unquote free socialist society where the workers were in fact still just being controlled and ordered about by an oligarchy that was composed of a computer, which was itself still overseen and controlled by an elite ruling class of socialist apparatchiki, and a foreign cybernetic management consultant, was a dream that ultimately died. To some degree, I would say, it is a side effect of the vagueness of whatever socialism is in the first place. If a goal cannot be precisely defined in material terms in the first place, the goal cannot be achieved. But similarly, if the goal of the dream state is not precisely definable, then the dream and its pursuit of its non-definable end state too never ends, and thus we are here. A world where many ideological zombies still inhabit their endless dream states, peering into your windows looking for possessions to expropriate. But what is socialism really? Perhaps it is just an ideology, a lower-ordered language that is spoken within the confines of a lower-ordered subsystem, one that reliably appeals to the sentiments of the masses who reside in that lower subsystem. And of course, aspirant elites who wish to climb the pyramid of power know this well. Promise the people everything, have them install you into power, and then tell them the bad news later. That, precisely to me anyway, is the metalanguage of political utility, the true metalanguage of socialism. A metalanguage spoken and understood by the aspirant elite ladder climbers, those who wish to ascend into the rarefied upper atmosphere of the elite control room. But the masses never seem to catch on, though the centuries pass. And thus, that promise of some vaguely defined utopian or utopian-like end state never loses its utility, because aspiring elite ladder climbers never run out of gullible members of the masses who will believe their aspirational promises of nonsense. The timeless desire to shake and rattle the bars of the cage, and to wish that the constraints of reality were only illusory. If only the perfect Rube Goldberg contraption could be erected, the bars would fade and dematerialize like a bad dream. Or maybe what Stafford beer set out to disprove in a more practical and concrete sense was the notion that a state-owned, centrally controlled command economy cannot quote-unquote work, and must always be inferior to a more free-market, private property-based, profit-driven system. Socialists often spend most of their time desperately trying to disprove claims made against their beloved socialism. In other words, to prove that whatever socialism is being defined as is not totally impossible, as if something not being 100% impossible is evidence of it being viable and robust. But nature does not favor what is only technically not impossible. Nature favors what is competitively viable and robust. Many bird species have come and gone, and when they are gone, in their nesting place, there are the invasive European sparrows and starlings, which need no help surviving. And in the fields, there will be feral pigs, and in the waterways, the invasive species of 50-pound carp. Many things are technically possible, but that does not mean that they are viable and robust in the face of competitors who are both of those things. But as we have suggested, socialism ultimately lacks a concrete definition, and thus it slips out of the net like a wriggly eel, always ready to survive another day within some dream space somewhere. The non-viable dream that never seems to die. But that does not necessarily mean that management cybernetics itself is not viable. Today, cybernetic management is indeed used to great success by the globalized and technicized economic machine to manage and control manufacturing processes and supply chains, algorithmically forecast demand, to cybernetically steer consumers such that they, in the words of Bertalanffy, buy what they should, etc., etc. And this makes sense and agrees with Beers' law of viability, which is as follows. Every viable system contains and is contained in a viable system. When a viable cybernetic management system is contained within a viable system, the whole assembly is viable, and capitalism is a viable system. As some people have pointed out, Walmart, thanks to cybernetic management, has become a sort of centralized command and control economy, but it still relies upon the metalanguage of the global pricing mechanism as well as the demand and choice of the people that buy products, and it operates against a backdrop where the masses of people still live in an environment or within a field where material resources are not equally distributed, the latter of which guarantees that they have some impetus to do things, some reason to drive them forward and to climb over the activation energy barrier of life. But some socialists will even cling to Walmart's success and say that it is empirical evidence that disproves the claim that planned economies and command and control economies are ineffective, and thus Walmart, the holiest of capitalism's profit-maximizing holies, is itself some kind of proof of socialism's viability. In some alternate philosophical universe maybe, one where Socrates and Schrödinger stand around an obviously deceased cat, Perhaps they could engage one another in Socratic symposium as to whether or not the deceased cat was in fact alive or dead. But while they were doing so, a much more obviously alive cat could and would steal up behind them and steal off with a fish or other tasty treat that they had packed in their lunches, the lunches to which they were headed before they became sidetracked on their philosophical debate as to the status of the deceased cat that lay in rigor mortis before them. But back on topic. And since we are talking about cybernetics, which is the science of control, it is worthwhile mentioning another definition of socialism. Sometimes socialism is defined as collective ownership, where the people quote-unquote own the means of production, and all of the nation's assets are nationalized. A system where things are not owned by top-hat-wearing cigar smokers, but one in which everything is collectively owned by the vague metaphysical aggregate that is the people. But ownership is meaningless without control. I am a co-owner of the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, but I do not control it. And ultimately, control is only granted to the powerful. If I were a billionaire and I donated hundreds of millions of dollars to a political candidate, who eventually won the presidency perhaps, I could get a special friend appointed somewhere in the State Department, and I could indeed place a phone call, and the USS Gerald R. Ford would show up off the coast of some foreign adversary's doorstep. But I lack both power and billions of dollars, where billions of dollars is more or less equal to the ability to handle a lot of environmental variety. C'est la vie, such is life. Only variety restrains variety, and only power restrains power. Further, I could buy S&P 500 index funds or buy a basket of military-industrial complex stocks, and thus I could be a collective owner. But of course, collective ownership, when it is not invoked within a sentiment-tickling slogan anyway, is of course meaningless. And again, the failure of Cybersyn was in no way a failure of management cybernetics itself. Cybernetic management is merely a tool or instrument which will always be wielded by those with the requisite power to wield it. Such is life, c'est la vie. But history has no shortage of idealistic scientists who wish to use the instrument that they have created for idealistic, ideological goals. But the goals for which such instruments are always used is always the same. To quote Burnham, the Machiavellians or the elite theorists are the only ones who have told us the full truth about power. Other writers have at most told the truth, only about groups other than those for which they themselves speak. The Machiavellians present the complete record. The primary objective and practice of all rulers is to serve their own interest and to maintain their own power and privilege. There are no exceptions, no theory, no promises, no morality, no amount of goodwill, no religion will restrain power. Only power restrains power." End quote. And with that said, now that we have armed ourselves with some new vocabulary and applied it to that Cybersyn detour, we'll wrap up the video by returning to the matter at hand, how this emerging AI and algorithmic metasystem will potentially control and steer the globalized masses, such that we do not destroy the globalized and technicized economic machine, the system which keeps all 8.5 billion of us alive and which prevents a catastrophic collapse of the Earth's carrying capacity. First, to start with, we must anchor ourselves in Ashby's law. The controlling metasystem would have to possess the capacity to handle, absorb, neutralize, or restrain all of the variety that its environment could throw at it. And in this case, the globalized masses and all of their variety is what the controlling metasystem would have to restrain. Further, it is mathematically self-evident that any control system would not be able to individually control and manage billions upon billions of unique inputs. So what is needed is standardization, the forceful compression of variety down to a level that is indeed manageable. So here, if we do what that old BBC comedy show recommends and look around you, we can in fact see that we are increasingly living in a world where the globalized masses are being housed in digital informational silos of a local truth regime or of the locally true political formula, where these algorithmically created silos are themselves examples of a type of standardization and compression. And most people do not do anything that resembles quote-unquote thinking for themselves. So as such, many people already receive most of their thoughts about things in their worldview from their algorithmically manicured informational environment. Cookie-cutter thought forms, injection-molded cavities, precision mass-produced outputs. Specifications like one can find in a catalog. Every person is unique, but perhaps most people can be compressed and reduced into a quite limited set of categories. And of course, standardization is the first step to reducing variety. Further, thanks to the increasingly global reach of the internet, algorithms, social media, etc., more and more people are beginning to receive more and more of their inputs from this emerging algorithmic artificially intelligent controller. And as they interact with this control system, a portion of their outputs get routed back to the controller via feedback loops, and their worldviews, their semantic space, and their behavior ultimately get steered towards some reduced set of attractors that exist within this hyperdimensional data space, where ultimately these attractors are the algorithmic silos, where the algorithmic silos are like informational environments that their inhabitants find to be most stable, comfortable, and viability supporting. And with their potential energies having been suitably minimized within these little local minima pockets, their behavior in aggregate becomes more predictable. In other words, the variety of their outputs reduces such that the overarching metasystem controller can adequately and efficiently restrain the variety of the globalized masses, QED or something. And another part of this process is the modification of the anastomotic reticuli of the masses, our black boxes, which slowly happens over time as we continue to interact more and more with algorithms and AI. To reference a past video, the so-called re-bicameralization of the human mind as a result of a newly formed symbiote, the human-AI cybernetic loop. And then perhaps, once we, as the collective humanity, as the globalized mass, have our variety suitably reduced and accommodated by the metasystem's architecture, which grows around us continuously as a sort of delocalized mesh, we will be left with our own synthetic goal state, a drive to enrich our basic environmental enclosures that are provided to us by the metasystem. In other words, a reason to keep doing things, to keep thinking, and to keep creating in pursuit of a reward, the reward of digitized tokens. In a zoo, the zookeepers speak of providing enrichment to the animals, but in this human zoo, we would merely choose and select our own specific flavor of enrichment that we would purchase with our surplus digital tokens. Can you tolerate eating more Soylent slop than the next guy? Trade in your surplus tokens in exchange for something that you think is worth trading for. And perhaps the guy who wants better food will be happy to raise or lower his thermostat such that he can build a surplus of digital tokens that he can use to buy better food. Most men are happy living in barren living quarters, a bed sitting on the ground next to a lamp within a decorationless room. They are making sound economic decisions based on what they value. They do not value such things, and as such, they do not spend their precious resources on them. Instead, they choose to spend their resources elsewhere. This hypothetical future system would be no different. Some people love sitting and watching a screen all day, something that is probably quite energy efficient when compared with physical world entertainment, and they can collectively trade in the tokens they save by watching screens all day, such that their collective supported content creator can buy a vehicle, drive around the countryside, go camping, and film themselves, such that they can make more entertaining content for their supporters. This system is already viable. It is just called YouTube, Twitch, Patreon, etc., and it excels at accommodating unimaginable variety, tastes, interests, etc., and it also provides for a more energetically efficient, digitized economic space, where differential value systems and the human drive for status seeking can be accommodated and its more negative externalities dissipated. Via this dynamic, the human drive for status seeking can continue on in the most energetically and efficient way possible, and perhaps this whole human experiment can continue on indefinitely without requiring us to strip all of Earth's resources and to avoid hitting that eventual and absolute carrying capacity ceiling. And perhaps there will be a universal basic income, a baseline guaranteed quantity of boring, metabolically optimized but not very tasty food, and a complementary device, a screen by which we can interact with the digital information space in the emerging digital economy, where perhaps we will maintain our impetus to do things such that we can consume and create physical and digital products alike, which can then be traded on balance for extra credits, such that we can buy slightly better food or better trinkets and baubles for our hyper-efficient living pods, or to access more intellectually stimulating information, or perhaps, as we will be drowning more and more in information, merely a breadcrumb trail to find information worth consuming itself has immense value. And in that way, the human drive to compete for status can be maintained in the most energetically efficient manner and on whatever game board or game boards most suits the person. And all of the comings and goings of this increasingly digitized ecosystem, a fully audit-trailed ecosystem, will generate a wealth of data for the artificially intelligent algorithmic controller such that it can keep its models fresh and avoid model collapse and avoid the ultimate doomsday scenario. The catastrophic collapse of Earth's carrying capacity can be avoided. And if you think this sounds ridiculous, we increasingly inhabit this system already. The digitized attention economy is already viable. And in the background, while we, the globalized masses, are kept suitably managed and the variety of our outputs kept suitably constrained, the artificially intelligent controller can increasingly control and manage the globalized and technicized economic machine, balancing all of its inputs and outputs with one overarching goal: to maintain the stability and viability of the overall metasystem, a globalized organism, and perhaps most importantly of all, to prevent the globalized masses, which are analogous to the cells of its body, from having a runaway autoimmune reaction and attacking the life-giving infrastructure that surrounds them. Or something like that, anyway. And remember, today there are 8.5 billion humans on Earth, which necessarily implies that the carrying capacity of Earth has been raised to at least 8.5 billion people's worth. In the past, it was only 1, 2, or 3 billion people's worth. So in the grand scheme of things, the picture that I have painted here is not too bad, exercises in dystopian optimism, and it is certainly better than if the globalized masses all begin attacking their life support system, thus bringing the carrying capacity of our global metasystem crashing down. That would suck. And maybe, just maybe, in this way, we won't have to force the billionaires to resort to using their doomsday bunkers. And with that said, we'll end with a quote from The Rise and Decline of Nations, published in 1982 by Mansur Olson. To quote Olson, "These changes in the patterns of incentives in turn deflect the direction of a society's evolution. In every environment, those who are best suited for that environment are most likely to thrive, survive, and multiply. There is evolution in the zoo as there is in the jungle, as those animals that are able to adapt to cages and keepers outlast those that cannot. So also with cultural evolution and evolution in human societies. Every society, whatever its institutions and governing ideology, gives greater rewards to the fittest for that society." End quote. But anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. And before you go, stay tuned for a preview of a future video that I'll get to here in a second. But as far as this video, it was a fun video to make. And thanks to the guy who recommended Stafford beer's his viable system model in the brain of the firm to me. I'm not sure if this is what you anticipated when you made the recommendation, but this perhaps quite unsurprisingly is what I came up with. But right now I'm working on what will eventually be a new future video based on the works of Mansur Olson. But in the meantime, before I sign off, I'll end this video with a preview of those ideas. I've already posted the following preview to my Patreon and as a members only post on YouTube. And to some degree, it dovetails nicely with the topic of this video, as well as the data that we have analyzed here with respect to resource consumption and population growth. So again, thanks to all of you who have watched my videos, subscribed and left comments and recommendations. And of course, special thanks to all my financial supporters on Patreon and to the YouTube members. And I'll close the video with this preview about the so-called super-encompassing interest and how it provided me with a rare eureka moment with respect to understanding globalization and our system's trajectory. The preview, which is under the tentative title, The Super-Encompassing Interest Imperative, or Why You Will Own Nothing. The following will contain excerpts from Mansur Olson's book, Power and Prosperity, Outgrowing Communist and Capitalist Dictatorships, published posthumously in the year 2000 after his untimely death. A year or so later, in 2001, China would join the World Trade Organization and the final stage of the managerial revolution would begin. I bought this book because it discusses a very interesting dynamic in the evolution of civilizations. As a society develops, it goes from a state of anarchy, one ruled by what Mansur Olson calls the roving bandits, and then over time, a particularly successful roving bandit settles down and becomes a sedentary bandit. Such sedentary bandits are ultimately responsible for forging a society and ultimately a civilization by providing security for his now sedentary and stationary community, such that long-term investments, infrastructure building, and technological specialization can occur. In other words, this sedentary bandit begins to build an encompassing interest in the society rather than a narrow interest. This is the genesis point of a civilization, one where the people who increasingly inhabit this system are transitioned from a state of anarchy and instability, an environment of entropy, to one of law and order, private property, technological development, labor specialization, and contract law, negentropy, the building blocks of civilization. But civilizational history has, up until this point, still been a patchwork of various local sedentary bandits, nation-states, and regional empires. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, however, we had reached the monopolar moment, and the opportunity had seemingly come to finally build that single totalizing, super-encompassing interest, one that would span to nearly the entire globe, except for some rebellious, autarkic nodes anyway. Further, with respect to investments, a long-term investment horizon and guaranteed stability over that long time period is necessary, such that the returns on an investment can be maximized. And perhaps when the relationship between the US and China is viewed in this way, along with the shareholder aggregators, the asset managers, the vast wealth redistribution events that have occurred over the past 3 decades, and the general themes we can extract from the World Economic Forum doctrines, we can perhaps best understand this constellation of things in the lens of the super-encompassing interest group. While reading the early pages of Power and Prosperity, specifically the following excerpts, I had a sort of eureka moment. A sudden understanding about globalization had crystallized for me, and the trajectory of the last 30 or so years suddenly made perfect sense. It was this imperative to create this ultimate super-encompassing interest, one that would grow to consume the entire world, and it would be one ruled by a globalized and delocalized post-national group of elites, the managerial mesh. One where this necessary condition, overarching global stability, and perhaps most critically, the security of international maritime routes, would be guaranteed by the might of the U.S. military, the world police, while China would become the world's factory, one hand washing the other. Further, in the decades that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, while China built its industrial engine, the U.S. would funnel almost all investments into information technology, the instruments needed to maintain cybernetic control over an increasingly globalized and technicized economic machine, as well as the increasingly globalized masses. And, or as the theory goes anyway, as this group's interests become super-encompassing, they begin to approach quote-unquote benevolence, and perhaps benevolence on a global scale looks a certain way. And the excerpts from Mansur Olson's Power and Prosperity are as follows. To quote Mansur Olson, "We have now examined the logic of power for interests so narrow that they take no account of the interests of society, i.e. criminals and roving bandit types and Hobbesian anarchies, and for interest groups with such an encompassing interest stake, i.e. a so-called super-encompassing interest group, that their self-interest leads them to act as though they were totally benevolent. In this analysis, I've taken it for granted that each interest has an incentive to think of the long run, i.e. what economists refer to as borrow infinite planning horizon. In reality, some interests have no reason to be concerned about the long run. For very narrow interests, i.e. criminal and roving bandit types in anarchic environments, this makes no difference. They take little or no account for the interests of society, whether they are thinking of the long run or the short run. But for encompassing interests, it makes a great deal of difference. We know that an economy will generate its maximum income only if there is a high rate of investment, and that much of the return on long-term investment is received long after the investments are made. To reach the maximum income attainable at a given tax rate, a society must enforce contracts, including those involving long-term loans, impartially, but the full gains are again reaped only in the long run. To obtain the full advantage from long-run contracts, a country also needs a stable currency. A stationary bandit, i.e. an encompassing interest, will therefore reap the maximum harvest in taxes, and his subjects will get the largest gains from his encompassing interests in the productivity of his domain only if he is taking an indefinitely long view, and only if his subjects have total confidence that their right to private property and impartial contract enforcement will be permanently respected, and that the coin or currency will retain its full value." End quote. And for that last part, we can only assume that one day the returns will have been suitably maximized, such that the need to guarantee us private property rights and impartial contract enforcement will end, and we will own nothing, because ultimately, to own something is to have an interest, and if an interest group is to become truly super-encompassing, it must own and control all of the resources. So if you made it this far to the second end of this video, thanks again for continuing to watch, and have a nice day or night.